These are the most basic questions in bass fishing. Where do they live? What cover do they prefer? And do they come back to the same spot year after year? A 2-year tracking study has the answers, and it could help you find bass faster on your lake. I'm super excited to share this study with you. This is one of the best tracking studies I've ever seen. It was published in 2021, it was peer-reviewed, and it looked at a lot of the basic questions we always want to know about bass. What type of cover do they prefer? Do they like grass cover? Do they like wood cover? Rocky shoals? Do they like deep flats? And let's look at this by season. Does it vary from spring to fall to winter to summer? And then do they use the same areas year after year? Do they go back to the same shoal or the same weed clump year after year? This study actually tracked largemouth bass. We're talking good sized ones up to 5-pounders. It did it for over 2 years. It looked at them in every season of the year, and it tracked exactly where they went year after year. Really fascinating stuff. Let's dive into it. So the biggest thing that these researchers wanted to find out in this study is, did bass go back to the same spots? It's called Fidelity. You know of like salmon, they're hatched way up rivers. They go out to the ocean, spend a few years, come back and spawn those exact same spots. That's Fidelity, going back to the same spots. This study was done on Lake Eugenia, which is in Ontario, which is in southern Canada. It was created in 1916. It's an older lake, but it's a reservoir, and it has interesting characteristics because of that. It's shallow overall. The average depth is only like 5 feet, but it does have a maximum depth of pretty much 40 feet, and it has a big drawdown. In the winter drawdown, they'll draw it down about 6.5 to 8 feet, so you're talking a lot. In the summertime, you're looking at a size, it's 1,562 acres. In the wintertime, it draws it down to 724 acres, so they really pull this thing back in. So I'll pop up a map for you here so you can really see it. On the left, this is in the summertime when it's at full pool and you can see the whole lake. The dark blue, that's the deepest areas. The lighter the blue, the shallower it is. You can see on the right side or the east side there, pretty shallow water. And then the map on the right-hand side of the screen, that's how small it gets in the summertime, or in the wintertime, during drawdown. Remember on the left there, it's about 1,500 acres. In the winter on the right, it's about 700. Now what they also mapped out here is when you look at the green, that's submerged aquatic vegetation. They had like pondweed, eelgrass, and coontail made up those grass clumps. You can see quite a bit of it in that northern section and the southern section, all on the eastern side there mostly. And then the brown, that is woody habitat. So there's stumps and some scattered standing timber. Most of that you can see is shallow, again on the east or the south side there. And then the red are shoals, and those are basically humps or high spots. You can see those again are mostly in the shallows. When you look at the wintertime, you can see there's still some grass that remains, especially on the kind of the northeast and southeast corners. And then a little bit of shoals that show up, those red spots, but the wood habitat during the drawdown is totally gone. Now, the researchers actually mapped all this out, so 100% of the wood cover is gone during the drawdown, 60% of the shoals are gone, and 57% of the aquatic vegetation is lost during drawdown. Now, in terms of timing of when the drawdown happens, basically it's at full pool from May through mid-October. Then during mid-October into November is when they draw it down. December through March, it's at its winter drawdown or lowest levels, and then it starts to fill up again in late March into early April. Now for the fish that they used in the study, they used 27 largemouth. They actually caught these fish, and they put radio transmitters in them that lasted for over 16 months. And that the fish, the size, they were pretty good sized largemouth. You're talking 14 to 20 inch largemouth. They averaged 16 inches in size, and they ran from 1.7 up to 5-pounders. So these are keeper size quality fish. They averaged 2.4 pounds. Now for the release of these fish, they did a couple different things. 24 out of the 27 fish, they released exactly where they caught them. They inserted a transmitter, released them back to the lake exactly where they were caught. Now the other 3 fish, they caught those in the wintertime, and they transported them basically all the way across the lake, 1.5 miles from where they were caught, put the transmitter in and released them, and they wanted to study, did those fish hang around or they swim back where they were caught? So the tracking portion of this study, it went from August 2015 up to September 2017, so over 2 years. They tracked them a total of 28 times, each of the fish. They attempted to, and they did it 3 to 6 times per season. Now, the seasons, they define these as spring, is the equinox and solstice and stuff. So it's your calendar spring, the March 20th, 21st up to June 20th, 21st in there. So it's the calendar spring. It's not when all of a sudden the days changed and stuff. The temperatures got right. Now, one last thing before we dive into the results. They classified the lake, the cover, and the structure by 4 different types. The first one being weed cover, the submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV. That's, again, your pondweed, your eelgrass, and your coontail. The second type was woody habitat. There were some big stump fields like I noted before, and then a little bit of standing and falling timber in the western basin as well. Then they had the shoals, which again are kind of like humps or high spots. Some of it's sandy or rocky or whatever, but that's kind of a bottom structure where you have humps or high spots where the lake comes up fairly quickly. And then finally, just to prove they're scientists and not fishermen, the barren areas, just kind of the barren flats, they call that exposed substrate. We just call those barren areas, or just deep flats, or structureless flats. All right, now into the fun stuff. Let's talk about the results. And the first thing they looked at is how much did the fish cluster in each of the seasons, meaning in the winter, did they all get in one spot? Or were they all spread out? Same thing with the fall, spring, summer. Were they spread out, or most of the population really tightly grouped together? So I'll put up the maps here by season, but let's start with winter. And did they cluster in winter? You darn bet they did. Look at this right here. Basically all the fish, and of course the lake got smaller because of drawdown, but these fish really got in a tight area. 74% of the fish, they were all within a 27-acre area of that 724-acre lake in the wintertime, like they noted. So most of the fish all got in one area. Now remember, this is in Canada. These lakes freeze in the wintertime. Wintertime bass, they have a little bit different requirements under the ice and stuff with flow and oxygenated water and everything. But definitely these fish clustered up really tight in the wintertime. Now let's transform this to spring. When you look at the map here, this actually has the lowest amount of clustering. These fish, as you might expect, are just exploded all over the map. And obviously they're spawning then. They use any of the suitable habitat. They're back up in the shallows. The lake's big again, but you can see on the map here, they are all over the place. You don't see the dark blue. Basically, the darker the blue those circles are, that's how many fish are in an area. It's very light blue, and it's just faintly all around the map. These fish are spread out like we know in the spring and spawning all over the place. Now we take a look at summer. You can see that these circles get a little bit darker. They're definitely grouping up a little bit. They're not as spread out as they were in the spring. Some areas of the lake don't seem like any of the 27 test fish were even in. And they're starting to group up some, but they're pretty still spread out, as you would expect in the summertime. They're using a lot of different habitat, but they're kind of grouped up. They definitely have a few prime areas. If you were fishing like that bottom right there, looks like a group. That top left up there in the northwest corner looks pretty good. And then those little bays there kind of on the eastern side look pretty good as well. Now, fall was a little bit different. They weren't that clustered there, but the one year they were more clustered. They were within 650 yards of each other. The next year it was over 1,000. So it depends on the year there, and you can see they're spread out again. That northwest corner where they tend to winter, where we saw in the winter, they're definitely making a move there, but very spread out too. They're not really densely grouped up yet. They're spread all over the lake pretty evenly at this point still. So that measured the clustering, again, how tightly the fish were together or how spread out over the entire lake they were. But what about the fidelity? Do the individual fish, does one bass go back to the same spot each winter, the same spawning spot each spring, or do they use different ones every year? So the answer for summer and winter is definitely yes, especially in the winter. From one year to the next, most all the bass were within 100 yards of where they were the winter before. So their winter location in 2015 and 2016 for each fish was usually only about 100 yards or slightly more different from year to year, almost the exact spot. Now we saw a very similar thing in summer as well. That was a slightly bigger range, but most of those fish were just a little bit over 100 yards away from where they were the year before, and the biggest range they saw was only 250 yards away from where they were the summer before. So basically they're going back from year to year to the same winter spots and the same summer spots that they were the year before. Fall, on the other hand, the fish did not go back to the same places. In average, from 2015 to 2016, it was 500 yards difference from the year before to the next year. They used totally different areas. And then the spring, they weren't able to publish the data on that just because they weren't able to relocate enough fish. They had some different ice conditions and stuff from one year to the next. So suffice it to say, from here, summer and winter, they go back to the same exact spots. For fall, they definitely did not, and they weren't able to exactly say for spring. Now remember, there were 3 of the fish that they didn't release where they caught them. That was in November, and they took those fish. They were all in that wintering site in the northwest corner up there where they're all grouped up. They took them all the way across the lake, 1.5 miles away, and released them. Did they swim back? Well, guess what? Within 4 to 12 days, all 3 of those fish had returned almost all the way. They were all within 700 yards. And within a couple weeks, they were all within 250 to 500 yards. Basically, they went back to those same wintering spots in the dead of winter when they took them all the way across the lake. So what about the habitat? Remember, there were some weedy areas. There were brushy, woody type areas. You had the shoals and just the flats out there. What did the fish prefer? And did it vary by season? Did they like the grass in the winter and like the shoals in the spring? They dove into it and gave us some results. So let's start with winter. And remember, most of those fish are clustered again in one corner of the lake. In both those years, that small little area, 94% of those fish got on just barren flats. They weren't around shoals or grass, even though some were in the water. They were in just open, barren areas. Now, the researchers weren't sure if this was necessarily because they preferred it or those were just the right conditions for the fish to be able to survive during the winter. But regardless, those fish weren't around any cover. They were just on those barren flats. And I should clarify that a little bit. I say barren flats. There were some trenches and troughs, old channels and stuff. So the bottom wasn't necessarily flat, but there was no cover around it. So basically, they were just in coverless, open water that's basically deeper than the rest of the lake. One more note so you can follow along on this. When they talked about the aquatic vegetation, again, the grasses in there, they classified it in 3 different categories. There was low density, which was basically less than 25% coverage. So 75% of the area or more was open and weeds were 25% or less. The middle was 25 to 75% of the area was covered by aquatic vegetation. And then high was more than 75%. So your really thick, deep, dense weed patches there would be the high. So in the spring, when it's time to spawn, they're feeding up for the spawn. What did they get around? Well, most of them were around just the bare bottoms or shoals or areas with low concentrations of weed, that low density of weeds. Only 6 times out of all the observations that they did they find bass in the really dense weed patches. So they weren't around that. They like the thin weeds, more open areas like the shoals and just the bare bottoms. Now let's contrast that with the summer, where 50% of the bass were located in areas with moderate to high, very dense weed patches. That's where half the recordings were. They also used everything, though, a little bit of everything, so you find them in all types of cover. They use the shoals and the barren areas quite a bit, so they like those structural type elements, but they also really got around the dense weed patches more in the summertime than any other time of the year. Now in the fall, like most of our experience, it's way more random, way more scattered out. They use the low coverage weed patches, the thin weeds. They use the shoals. They use the just exposed substrate, as they call it, the barren flats. They use those, and it was totally spread out. It was just pretty much random, and they used a little bit of everything. Typical fall kind of junk fishing where you can catch a few fish on a little bit of anything, but you don't find a lot of them anywhere. So at least on Lake Eugenia here, for weeds, when did the bass use them? Winter. Even though there were weed patches there, they used it basically none. It was almost non-existent. Spring, they used it more, but it was the very thin weeds. So a lot of times I like to get around those clumpy weeds, or where there's a hole in the weeds spawn. That's not too surprising. Summertime, that's when they used them the most. Remember, all the recordings were there, and they liked that moderate to really dense weed patch. And then once the fall, they stopped using it as much, and they like the thinner weeds. So basically thick weeds in the summertime, thinner in the spring and fall. They were skipping them in the winter. Now, at the wood habitat, it seems like these fish didn't relate to them as much as I would expect, especially in the southern reservoir. But also remember, like in the late fall through the winter, they're not even, that's all high and dry. It's shallow stump flats. I would have expected more use in the spring, but it was, like I said, it was only used summer and spring. And it wasn't a dominant player here. It kind of showed, at least in these, like it happens in a lot of northern lakes, and even with their southern reservoirs, from Sam Rayburn and Lake Fork, all these Texas ones I fish, I always have told people that to me, grass is like a trump card. They love getting around woody cover, but man, if there's grass, the hydrilla and coontail, any of that stuff, bass just love grass. They'll always use that over the wood if they have the option between the two. And then the shoals, like the high spots and stuff, they use those a decent amount in spring and fall. Basically, in the winter, I find this surprising, but those high spots and stuff in winter, even though they still had some, almost non-existent. Then in the summer, they used it some, but it was key that the shoals were set up in relation to the weed beds. So they kind of like the weeds and the shoals that were near the weed beds. Also remember, these were all largemouth. I'm sure if there were smallmouth they were tracking here, there would have been a lot more shoal use, but the largemouth really weren't that interested in the shoals. Now here's where the study takes another cool turn, and it dives into from one year to the next in the 4 different seasons. Was it consistent? Did the bass use the same cover? So did they use grass both years in the summer? Or one year did they use grass mostly, but the other year they used, say, more shoals or just bare bottom? Starting off with winter, the answer is definitely yes. 88% of the fish both years used just that barren, coverless bottom. So this is where the study takes a little bit of a turn. I find this really interesting. Starting with the spring, there was an overlap of about 56% with the cover. So basically that means the fish that were using shoals in year 1, they would use 56% of them were using the shoal again the next year. The ones that used the grass in year 1, they were using grass about 56% of the time the next year. That means about half the fish went to the same type of cover in the spring, half of them did not. So fish that lived in the grass in the spring of 2015, half of them weren't using that same type cover. That tells you that from year to year, maybe the grass pattern's the strongest, and you have a year where it's, man, this spring was this cranking, I was doing rocky banks, or I was, throwing a bladed jig in the grass and catching them so good. Well, those fish don't even necessarily relate to grass the next year. Found that pretty interesting that half of them don't even go back to the same type of cover. So saying, what's the best habitat in the spring? You tell somebody it's grass, or it's rocky banks, or it's flipping stumps or something like that. These fish showed that half of them, they prefer something totally different the next year. And then same with the summertime fish. 57% of them, almost 60% preferred the same thing from one year to the next, but that means over 40% of them wanted something totally different in terms of grass, wood, bare bottom, shoals from one year to the next. And then, of course, the fall, which is always flaky, that was under 50%. It was 49% of them preferred the same habitat. Basically, from one fall to the next, you catch them in the grass the one time, and it's 1 hour to the next or 1 day to the next, but those fish did not have fidelity or the same interest in one type of cover from one year to the next at all. So where does that leave us? What did the researchers conclude based on everything that they learned? A few takeaways that you can use in your fishing. So the biggest thing they noticed here was the fact that the fish did have fidelity to certain areas. They were going back to similar areas and they could find their way back. They were pretty amazed by this, just due to the fact that the lake for about half the year was drawn down where these flats and shallow areas were high and dry, and somehow they were able to make their way back to these same areas year after year. They weren't sure how they did it, if they did it by scent and odor and current, or if it was navigational kind of memory, what they did, but somehow these bass were making it back to where they went year after year. Now in the spring, here's another little nugget here I found interesting. The fish started to move, even though the water temperature was like 43 degrees and colder, they started to move as soon as the lake was refilled. So these flats have been high and dry for about 4 months, but by early April, water's 43 or colder, and these fish are already moving back to the spring. They haven't even seen those spots for 4 months. I guess they still know they exist. And once that water comes up, it seems like maybe it's the length of days, but they sense that that water's up again. I don't know if the food's going there or they know they have to spawn, but they're boogieing over there. Even though the water's cold, they're already on their way to spots where they hadn't seen for months and months. Another big takeaway here was the fact that they were so tightly grouped in the wintertime. And these are fisheries managers. One of the main things they're looking at are harvest regulations, size regulations, limits and stuff. And they were worried that the season was still open and these fish in the wintertime are densely packed. There's a lot of competition, making them fairly easy to catch. And I can understand that with creel limits and stuff. You want to limit, make sure they're not over harvested. I guess the flip side is once the fall and winter comes, only the diehards are out there. It's typically cold and miserable, and a lot of guys are off deer hunting and bird hunting and all that stuff. And as a catch and release fisherman, I do like that, and I think we've all seen it sometimes. The lakes aren't that crowded in the fall. The bite, there's a lot of dead water, but man, this proves it, especially in a lot of these northern lakes. Man, those fish get grouped up. I don't know how they want to manage them and put the creel survey, but I want to put a hook in every single one of them. So it sounds like if I'm fishing this lake, I'm going up there in the late fall and the winter. I'm fishing those concentration areas, and when you get a single bite, there's probably a lot around there. So that I know where I'm fishing in the wintertime. Now, contrast to that with the fall, and like we've all known, it's a great time to cover water. They just noted again, those fish were in a migratory state. They weren't in the same type of cover. They were spread all over the lake. So basically, don't slow down in the fall. Those fish are on the move. It's hard to predict where they're at from one day to the next, 1 year to the next. Cover water, run into those fish. Don't hunker down and look for one key spot, because based on this study, it's not there. Now, in the summertime, what they took away is they were faithful, or there was high fidelity going back to those same areas year after year in the summer. But remember, some of them use different types of cover, but the main thing they noted here was complex combinations is what they look for. So this was the time where if you have the grass and a drop off or the shoals and stuff like that, they're looking for basically more complex type cover. So you get the mix of grass with other factors is good. And they do have a pretty small home range that go back to the same spots. They weren't sure if that's because the fish were more territorial or there was only so much of this key type habitat. But definitely they noted that the more complex type ones, again, the edges of the weeds and shoals and stuff, where you have more factors there, that seemed to play into where those fish were at in the summertime. And again, they were going back to those same type of areas year after year. And then finally, they pointed out that one of the big limitations of the study, this lake had big shallow flats where most of the cover was. Most of that, the drawdown was very significant. It was for a big part of the year and moved a lot of those fish off those shallow flats. Lakes with either a smaller drawdown or no drawdown, as in those, may have a totally different result. Some of this may be due to the fact of a drawdown, so they didn't have a control here. It would have been great if they had, say, a natural lake or a steady state reservoir where they could check and see the differences. But a lot of our reservoirs do go through the fall and winter drawdown, so you can probably draw some parallels there. And definitely you can see that fish are able to go back to similar areas. So depending on the lake, if they choose to, if they do it, they definitely have the capability to do it. Pretty fascinating study. Enjoyed sharing it. Hopefully it helps you catch a few more fish.